ain't going on. I can't see it. Take it easy. Take it easy.
How's everyone doing here? Alhamdulillah. We had some time off, alhamdulillah, 2 weeks. Time to review your notes, catch up on everything, right?
We need to put online too about the books so that they know.
Okay. I forgot where we at. Like, I'm lost. I know we covered the hadith about the ruqya last time, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We did the whole session, just that hadith, or was there other stuff I did?
We went all the way to the 8 weeks for all of the organs with embryology.
Oh, got it. Okay, the stages.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, sound rahmatullah together. Alhamdulillah. I'm all right, just running. Alhamdulillah. I started a new job, so I've been busy. I think 11:30 works better for me, and that gives us an hour for the class, 11:30, 12:30, and like half an hour before it's over for questions. That's a good. Pero, no. No, I see it. Yeah, nice. Nice, but there's no place for me to write.
We can
Like,
erase it. We can erase it.
well,
I would like to find out, see if they can do me some calligraphy.
right. No, don't erase it.
Don't erase it.
I'll try to work under it, leave that for a while. When we need to erase it, we'll do it. So, like sound.
Somehow ensoulment.
Oh, ensoulment, yes.
That's been in and out of my mind ever since.
Right.
But that word today,
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
I guess every creation of Allah will have your husband did this? Reciprocal in their life until they return to Allah. You always evolve.
And there's so much mystery in there that we don't know. So much unknown in Allah's creation. SubhanAllah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So I'm not sure where I'm at. I'm a little lost having 2 weeks off and with my busy schedule. But what I want to do today, maybe today we can look at the structure of the Sahih. So the structure, the makeup of the Sahih. I don't think we did a whole class on that. Structure of Sahih Bukhari. So one of the important things is that you learn as a student how to read a book, how to access sources, because every book is written differently. So if you're accustomed to one type of book, and that's all you're used to, and that's the only thing you can navigate, then when you come to a book of fiqh, you'll be lost. When you come to a book of hadith, you might be lost. If you read a book of hadith written in the 20th century, it's very different from a book of hadith written in the 3rd century, in the time of Imam Al-Bukhari. A science book is very different. A book on geography is going to be very different. So you have to understand how to read books. And that's part of what I'm trying to teach here. We're trying to increase your appreciation of the work of Imam Al-Bukhari. And I hope we did, how many classes we've had so about 5 or 6? Okay. I hope you have a good idea and a good sense of who Imam Bukhari was, how important this book is, and how deep it is. Today, let's try to look at how Imam al-Bukhari constructed his book. Because to find any hadith, it's easy to quote a hadith, but when you look it up, it's very, very difficult. Before the class, I was trying to look up a hadith. I know what chapter it's in, but now every publication, translation is different. So here, the hadith I found online on sunnah.com, it says volume 1, page such and such. So it's not on that. I don't know what edition they're following, so I couldn't find it like that. The volume 1 of this is still missing. Somebody took it and never returned it. So, brothers. Oh, okay. No, that's Abu Dawood. That's not Bukhari. Volume 1 of Bukhari is missing. Is that it? Okay, no, you hold on to it, sister. I want you to turn to this page and see if I'm trying to. So I don't have the page number, but I have book 5, hadith number 268. Book 5, hadith 268. If you could find that, one of the sisters find that and pass it forward. So I found the hadith I'm looking for in this index here, in this particular book. And it says page 102. I looked at page 102, it's not there. I thought maybe, okay, it's not one, maybe it's hadith number 102. I looked up hadith 102, it's not that. So they have an index, it tells you where it is, it's just not there. So this whole index is wrong. So you might be having this edition of Sahih Bukhari, and you won't be able to find it. All this is wrong. So I'm trying to figure out why does it say 102 and it's not there. So eventually I went to the Arabic and found the hadith. And this is the hadith right here. It's on page 201. So they put 102 here. So they have the numbers reversed. So these kind of things happen. So these kind of things happen all the time. So you have to be very, very cognizant. You have to understand. So you have to understand how to find hadith, how Sahih al-Bukhari is constructed. If not, you'll be lost. You might even have the index. You still won't be able to find the hadith. So it's only because I had a little bit of sense of what chapter it's in, what bab it's in, I was able to find it. But you won't be able to look at even an index because they're written wrong. And you might not find the hadith. So this topic is very, very important. Did you find the hadith there? Volume 1? Yeah, let me have it. I just want to see if that's the same as the website. No? No, don't close it. I want you to find that hadith for me. Do some work for me. Find hadith number 268. And then pass it forward. I don't know. It's written wrong in this one. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. You know. Yeah, book 5, Hadith 268. That's what I have on the website. I'm just trying to see if we find a hadith on sunnah.com, is it according to this? Let me see. Yes, that's it. Okay, awesome. So sunnah.com is following this edition. So if you find a hadith on sunnah.com, I guess they have the page numbering from Darus Salam, this edition. So this one works, the one you have here. So it might not be all the Darus Salam editions because they publish them again and again. And Yahya is a bookseller, he knows. So it depends what year it's published. But generally speaking, the one you have here, it corresponds to sunnah.com. So good. So we're going to come to those hadith in a moment. But now, how is Sahih al-Bukhari constructed? So it's about 7,000 hadith. Right? I gave you the number in the beginning. So how are those hadith constructed? Like, how did he put the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari? Like, how did he formulate this book? Based on what? How did he divide it? How did he classify it? Anyone know? Anyone have ideas? Categories? What kind of categories? Okay, so by topics. So you mean by topics? Okay, good. Right, that's kind of true. Yes. So Imam Bukhari wanted to give you the strongest hadith that exists in the world, based upon his extensive research and learning. But he could have just put all those hadith together and gave you the book. Imam Ahmad did that. So Imam Ahmad, what he did, he's classified every hadith by the companion. So all the hadith of Abu Hurairah, all the hadith of Abu Bakr, all the hadith of Aisha in one chapter. So how did Bukhari give you those hadith? So he wanted to give you the strongest hadith. The brother alluded to it's by topics, but so how did he divide the book? Like, anyone know? Like when you open Sahih Bukhari, what do you find? Like in terms of divisions, other than topics? Like, if I tell you this hadith is in this, I mean, we don't use numbers, right? No, it's not alphabetically. We don't use numbers in hadith. Like when scholars quote hadith, they don't say Bukhari number 4. We do that today, Bukhari hadith 268. But that's a modern thing. That just started a few years ago. It was never like that. Yes, sister. Books, yes. So he has Sahih Bukhari divided into books, which is called kitab. So in English, the translation is kind of hard because Sahih Bukhari is a book, but it has books within it. So we would probably call those chapters. But within each kitab, he has a bab. Bab are the chapters. So he has a whole bunch of different kitabs, which is translated as books generally. So you can say sub-books or books within Sahih al-Bukhari, the larger book. And each book is composed of chapters. And every chapter is headed by bab. So from that perspective, you have kitab. So Sahih Bukhari it'll have a kitab, every hadith. Then it'll have a bab. So whenever you reference a hadith, what scholars do is this hadith is in Kitab al-Iman, bab qawlillahi azza wa jal kada. So they'll tell you what kitab is in and what bab the hadith is in. And that's the proper way of referencing hadith, because if you just go by numbers, you might not find it. I didn't find it here. If you go by the index, you might not find it, and I showed you the example. And the numbers are different according to different editions. So in this particular edition, Hadith 268 is not going to be the same as this edition. And you can compare it. It just depends on who the publisher was and how they're publishing the book. And also the numbering might be different. So numbering is not that useful. We don't go by numbers. In the Quran, it's useful because the Quran is smaller, Quran is agreed upon, and the Quran, nothing changes. So we can say chapter 4, verse number 68, that works. But it doesn't work for hadith because hadith books they have different transmissions, different publications, and sometimes it's complicated. The hadith is long and has 2 sections, so somebody might make that into 2 hadith and give you 2 different numbers instead of 1 number for a longer hadith. So anyway, kitab and bab. And bab, what's important to know is what kind of chapters does Imam al-Bukhari have? There's 3 types of chapters he has. And I'll use a different color here. So some chapters, he'll just put bab and no explanation or title. So these are title-less chapters. It just says bab. It separates the chapter but has nothing after bab and just has the hadith. So these are title-less chapters. Sometimes he does that. It's not that frequent, but he does that sometimes. And then many of the chapters he'll say bab and he'll give you a small name. Bab al-Tahara, for instance. Tahara is actually kitab, but bab, you can look up any one of these. So you have, I'm going to try to find you a nice small example. So this is Kitab al-Wudu, Bab as-Siwak. So Kitab al-Wudu, Bab as-Siwak, the toothstick, as-Siwak. So Kitab would be al-Wudu, Bab as-Siwak. Chapter on the Siwak, the Miswak or Siwak. So you'll have titleless chapters, just says Bab. You have short titles of chapters, or it could be slightly longer. It could be like this one has Man Bab Man Tatayyaba Thumma Ightasal wa Baqiya Athru Tayyib. The chapter on putting perfume on after making ghusl. And if traces of the smell remain. So it's kind of a long, almost like a sentence. So you might have no title, you might have a short title, it might be a sentence, but then he does something amazing. This is where he takes the cake. It's different from other books. He has something in Arabic, we call it tarajum. Tarajum. Tarajum is something peculiar to Imam al-Bukhari. Tarajum is an entire paragraph. You want to look at it that way, this is no words, short title, could be a word, it could be a sentence, but sometimes we'll have entire discussions, like an expanded chapter heading. So it's called tarajum. Singular for that is tarjuma, tarajum. So tarajum are some of his chapters, like before the hadith begins, you have entire paragraph, or it might even be a page of discussion. It might even be some hadith in there, and it might even be some statements of Umar or statements of scholars in there. So that's why people get confused when they read there's a hadith within the chapter heading. They'll think, oh, okay, that's hadith number such and such, but it's not. That's part of the chapter heading. He didn't get to his hadith yet. So that's what it's important to know. So this is kitab, bab, and then the content itself, the hadith itself, you can say the main body. In Arabic, we call it usul. Okay? So this is kind of like an outline of the structure. There's different kitab, then there are chapters. Most of the chapters have just short titles. Sometimes they're without a title. Sometimes they have hadith within the chapters. Chapter headings, the bab. It'll say bab, and it'll have a long discussion. And then after that, he has his hadith. So this is his hadith here. So you have to understand that. If you don't understand that, sometimes you'll read a hadith that's here, or a hadith that's here. He's not meaning to include it in his book. And you think, oh, it's in Bukhari. It's not. He's just referring to it in his chapter heading. But he didn't put it in the chapter. So why is he referring to his chapter heading? Basically, Imam al-Bukhari, well, you have to understand why he's doing what he's doing. So Imam al-Bukhari, he was the brilliant genius he was. He's trying to do more than one thing with everything, right? As I showed you the first hadith, just through the isnad and through his discussion, what he did with that hadith. He's teaching about the importance of intention. But within the hadith, he's taught us so many other lessons. So Imam al-Bukhari, what he's doing is he has two major purposes in compiling the Sahih. One, to give you the strongest hadith, the soundest hadith on record. As-Sahhu Sahih, undisputable authenticity hadith. That's his primary goal in writing the Sahih. And that's in his chapters. But then he has a second goal. The second goal was to teach you the deen, to teach you how to apply the hadith. And that's why he's different from other muhaddithin. He was teaching you your deen and teaching you where the hadith fit and what they mean and giving you lessons and insights. So that's where his insight comes out. Imam al-Bukhari's stature as a hadith scholar, you see that in the usul, the narrations that he has. They're strongest authentic. Nobody can dispute them. They're the soundest hadith on record. So Imam Bukhari as a muhaddith shines in his main body, the usul. But Imam Bukhari as a faqih, as a person of ijtihad and fiqh and insight, that shines in the tarajum, in his chapter headings, in his abwab wa tarajum. That's why there's a famous statement, Fiqhul Bukhari fi tarajumihi. The insight or the fiqh of Bukhari is found in the tarajum, those chapter headings. Okay? Because that's where he explains, something about these hadith that he's going to share with you. So you've got to understand this two-tiered structure of Sahih al-Bukhari. Very, very important. Because if you don't understand that, you just read this as just one big book of hadith. Everything's the same in here. No, it's not. That runs into problems. I'm going to show you some. So this is very, very important, right? So his insight, his fiqh comes out here in his chapter headings. But his insight, his stature as a first-rate muhaddith, someone who knows the reports, knows what's sound and not, comes out in the hadith that he has in the book. Okay? Yes, brother. Mm-hmm. So Imam al-Bukhari put these chapter headings himself. Imam Muslim left out the chapter headings, but he assumed everybody would know. So Sahih Muslim is harder to find. All the chapter headings in Sahih Muslim are added by people later. And sometimes they didn't understand where the chapter ended, where it began, so they made mistakes. So Imam Nawawi is the one who added the chapter headings for Imam Muslim, and he made some mistakes here and there. Imam al-Bukhari did this himself. So it's found in the Arabic. So it depends on what kind of Arabic you have, the manuscripts. Sometimes they're in a different color. Sometimes they'll just put the word bab very big, and then the rest of the text is after, so you have to kind of read between the lines. But there is an indication of where the bab is, and sometimes if you don't know how to read the book, it gets confusing, and people do make mistakes. And I'll show you a prominent mistake people make. So this is kind of like the structure. You have to understand the structure. Imam al-Bukhari doesn't just have hadith with under a chapter with one word on it. Kitab al-Wudu, all the hadith. No, he's teaching you stuff in the chapter headings. That's important to know. And in these chapter headings, sometimes he'll add hadith there. Okay? So this is like a structure. Now I want to look at it from a different angle, and that is the hadith in Sahih Bukhari. This is also important. This is the same information, but from a different angle. Let me open my chart. So Sahih al-Bukhari has, in terms of the hadith content, it has a primary corpus. That's what we call the main body, primary corpus, which is a fancy word. And it has a secondary corpus. That's kind of the same thing I'm telling you here. But now this is the structure of the book. But now looking at the hadith, all the hadith that are in Sahih Bukhari. So they're either part of the primary corpus, usul. In Arabic it's called usul. Usul. Secondary corpus doesn't really have a word. That's an English word. That's our understanding of what he's doing. So this kind of makes sense to say it this way. So the primary corpus is like what I mentioned here, usul. That's the main body where he has the hadith. But a lot of hadith he shares, they're in, so where are the secondary corpus hadith? So these would be in the chapter headings. That's right here, these chapter headings. And then there would also be supporting hadiths. Sometimes supporting hadith within the chapters. Supporting hadith. So the secondary body of Imam al-Bukhari. So let me put this is two different charts so we don't mix them up. Okay. So primary corpus, no problem. It's easy to understand. The majority of the book is the primary corpus, the usul. But then sometimes he'll share hadith that are in the chapter headings, the tarajum, and sometimes he'll share hadith within the body, but as a supporting hadith. They're called mutaba'at or shawahid. They're not main body hadith, but sometimes, and I'll show you an example, it might be within the chapter, but it's not meant to be his main body, his primary corpus. So a lot of people quote hadith, they're found in Bukhari, but they're only in the chapter heading, and they'll say it's in Bukhari, it's sound. And that's a mistake. His primary corpus is sahih to the highest degree. This is what he meant when he said as-sahhu sahih, or when he intended to compile his book. So maybe use a different color here. So his primary corpus hadith, we can say they're first tier sahih. So sahih is different levels, right? It's not just hadith is sahih or not. There's sahih of the level of Bukhari and Muslim. It's a whole different level than sahih according to the level of Imam Tirmidhi and other scholars. So they're grades, right? So the primary first tier sahih, the most authentic hadith, that's usul, primary corpus. But then he has in the secondary corpus, second tier sahih reports. What do I mean by that? Second tier sahih is, there are a lot of hadith he shares, they're not according to his conditions here. They're not as-sahhu sahih, but they're still acceptable to some degree. So some of them are like, they have some failings. They have reporters that might be weak. So it won't fit this criteria. But it's still acceptable. So I'm trying to get you to understand why he shared hadith in the chapter headings and not in his, sometimes there are hadith in chapter headings that he doesn't share in the body. So for that is because they don't fit his conditions, but he still wants to share them with you. He still wants to show you something. He still feels they're acceptable. There might be second tier sahih. So the majority of these are second tier sahih. Now, here's another caveat. Let me just finish and then this chapter headings, what kind of hadith are in the chapter headings? So sometimes he has hadith in chapter headings that are already in the book. They're in the primary corpus, but he just alludes to them. So those are full primary tier sahih. So sometimes there might be another chapter where he wants to refer to a hadith. He might refer to a hadith that's already in his book with the full isnad. But he'll put it in the chapter heading as a mu'allaq. And that's another term, I'm trying to avoid it, but mu'allaqat. So generally the hadith in the chapter headings are called mu'allaqat. They mean, and I'm getting very complicated, but it is what it is. Mu'allaqat are isnad-less hadith. Isnad-less. Without isnad. Isnad-less. So just a hadith without a full isnad. So a lot of times Bukhari, he shares, so the hadith he shares in the tarajum, in the chapter heading, are without isnad. Or without a full isnad. So it doesn't have like, so-and-so reported to me, so-and-so reported to me. That's an indication that that's not his primary hadith. That's not part of his usul, that's part of his chapter heading. So why does he do that? Because he has two goals, right? The second goal is to teach you the deen. So when he has to teach you the deen and teach you how to apply hadith, sometimes he has to refer to things. Sometimes he brings other hadith that are already in the book, but he doesn't, in the chapter heading, he's not going to repeat the whole isnad. So he'll just refer to the hadith without the isnad. So these isnad al-hadith, some of them are just summarized from they're already in the Sahih, but he just summarized them. And sometimes they're not in the rest of the Sahih, they're only here, so they're second tier Sahih. Okay, questions? Yes, Mustafa had his hand up for a while. Uh-huh.
Is this where Imam Muslim also shares in terms of how he laid down the tier of the hadith? Because I noticed that Imam Muslim will start out with the weaker and then build to the stronger, which to bring it to the point.
So Imam Muslim's structure is entirely different. So this structure, both of them have the sense, every scholar has a sense of what's strongest and strong. So not every hadith is the same level. It doesn't mean hadith, so you have to get away from thinking of a hadith as good or bad, sahih or fabricated. It's not like that. It's a whole range. So even sahih hadith, there are levels, but the strongest level is this primary corpus of Bukhari and Muslim. So they had the sense that there's a higher level sahih that they wanted to share with the ummah. But then they also had a sense that there's other hadith that are also sahih, but they don't meet that criteria, but we can still use them. So what did they do? Imam Bukhari and Muslim, they have a lot of hadith in other books. Imam Bukhari didn't write the sahih only. He has Adab al-Mufrad. He has so many other books, Kitab Af'al al-Ibad. He has... So in those books, they're books of hadith and fiqh. They have a lot of hadith. So if there's a hadith that's in Bukhari's Adab al-Mufrad, and there are many that aren't in the Sahih, that gives you an idea that he accepted them, but they're lower level Sahih, second tier Sahih. So they had this sense of there's high level Sahih, high grade Sahih, and lower grade Sahih, if I could use that term. So in his Sahih itself, he uses the lower grade Sahih in the chapter headings. But the reason I'm sharing this here, not every hadith in a chapter heading is lower grade Sahih. Sometimes you have to understand, it might be already in the Sahih. So he's referring to it. So a lot of the hadith that are in the chapter headings are first tier Sahih, but if they're only there and nowhere else in the Sahih, they're second tier Sahih. And then the supporting hadith are just sometimes he'll bring a hadith and then he'll bring a supporting isnad after it, within the chapter itself, not in the chapter heading. So you have to understand this is a mutaba. It's a hadith that supports the primary hadith. So all this requires hadith knowledge. It requires literacy. It requires understanding, the purpose of these books, how they were constructed. If you don't know any of this and you just open up the book, you're going to make mistake after mistake. And you're not going to understand or appreciate the work of these scholars. So I know it's complicated, but if you want to take home a lesson, just take home this, that the book is constructed like this, kitab and chapters, and the chapters might be simple, longer, or extremely long, the chapter headings. So in these chapter headings, a lot of times Imam Bukhari is trying to share his insight. So the hadith is the hadith, but the chapter heading tells you what it means. So like there might be a hadith so when you read Sahih al-Bukhari, you have to read every hadith and look at the chapter heading that it's under to see what Imam Bukhari was trying to teach you, to give you an appreciation of what he's trying to teach us and what he was thinking. He could be right, he could be wrong, but you have to understand what he was. At least you can say Imam Bukhari feels this hadith means this by looking at the chapter heading. And sometimes we're confused about a hadith. I mean, that'll help you. If you look at the chapter that it's in, it'll tell you, you know what, okay, this is about wudu. This is about such and such a topic. Or at least that's what Imam Bukhari thought it was. So this is very, very important. And then here, just understand that there are two levels of Sahih in the Sahih. The main body is always primary tier Sahih. But in his supporting or his secondary corpus, which is the chapter headings, today what we would call these footnotes. When you write a book today in modern times, you have footnotes and endnotes. So you have the main book that you're writing. That paragraph is the main paragraph. But then you want to add some other information, and you don't want to put it in the main body. So you'll make a footnote. And every book you buy has footnotes. That means even today's times, people have this understanding that, look, I need to have a book a message I'm trying to give, but I need to add to that I don't want to be part of the message, but just like as a reference, or as a footnote, or as a supporting. So that's why every book has endnotes and footnotes. So in those times, this was their way of providing the footnotes. You can think of it that way. But they just put it in the same book because they didn't have that concept of putting it on the bottom. They just put it there, but he put bab before it, and you have to understand, where this information is placed and what it means. Okay? Any questions? I'll take a sister in the back. Yeah. That's your translation. Yeah. No, but it might not be the same. I might have a different translation, and you might have a different edition. They might use a different translation. Just keep that in mind. That's perfectly fine. Volume, section, subsection. I could say chapter, heading, section. I mean, it's up to you, whatever you want to use. But you have to understand, Imam Bukhari used kitab, bab, and so don't go by the English because it might be different. Like in these books, let's see what, this one says chapter for bab. And that makes sense. And then it says the book of ghusl. So generally, this one says book for this and chapter for this. Let me see this one. This one has chapter and the book of faith. Yeah, because these are roughly the same translation. It was Muhsin Khan who translated. He died earlier this year or last year, rahimahullah. But you could translate any way you want. But just keep in mind, these are independent books. That's how Imam Bukhari thought of them. And each one has a bab. And there might even be subsections within the bab. Today, what we would do, if I was translating, I would put, if there's a supporting hadith in the chapter, I'll put a line and make it a subsection to make it easier. That's how we would do. So this would be a subsection. So you might have even within the bab some subsections. So that's why if you translate it yourself, and it was up to you to give Imam Bukhari's message, so you can even within the bab put subsection, right, for the supporting hadith. It's not a lot of those, but there's a lot of the chapter headings. So this is huge for Bukhari. Okay. Let me see if I missed anything in my chart. Yes, brother in the front.
The contents of the chapter is explaining really what the heading, how did that heading come about.
Okay, no. Yes, but you got to flip it. The contents of the chapter is the hadith. That's the guidance of the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's what came to us. Chapter headings telling you what that means and how it came about. It's better to look at it that way. I know in English, we have a chapter and then we have the title, and then the chapter explains the title. But this is the other way around. The titles are explaining the hadith. Right? So, I mean, the Prophet didn't say these words to explain Imam Bukhari's chapter headings, right? But Imam Bukhari chapter headings are trying to explain the hadith, the content itself. Because this chapter has just words of the Prophet.
Okay, so that's how we got to summarize. The chapter has more or less, as you just said.
Yeah, chapter heading, Imam Bukhari might summarize the hadith and put it in there. So chapter heading, this is all from Bukhari, and he's quoting like scholars and hadith, but the body itself will only have Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's from the Prophet, because this is the book of hadith. So Imam Bukhari won't add anything in the chapter, the primary corpus, from himself. All the stuff he's trying to do, he'll put it here. But in the main body, he'll pick hadith, and he'll pick this isnad or that isnad. But he can't touch the hadith. That's the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. Yes, brother.
You said the title explains the hadith.
Explains Bukhari's understanding of the hadith.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
We know the isnad is a chain. So I'm trying to figure out is it's not dealing with the strength of the hadith.
No, I mean, because he's not concerned with establishing the strength of the hadith. That's here. That's the majority of the book. So the chapter heading is not the majority of the book. It's just a little bit here and there. I'm trying to teach you how to understand it. Don't come across as everything in Bukhari is this. Most of Bukhari is usul. It's the hadith. So like 80, 90% of the hadith in Bukhari are here. They're with isnad and they're teaching you the strength. But then in the chapter headings, sometimes he'll share something without isnad. And he's not telling you that it's sound. It's a soundist. He's telling you it's still acceptable, consider this information. But if you want to know the isnad for that, Ibn Hajar wrote a book. Like he traced every isnadless hadith in Bukhari and he gave the isnad for it. So there are hundreds of books written like that give you the isnad of where Bukhari got all this, and then you can evaluate whether it's sound or not. But Imam Bukhari is not concerned with establishing the strength of these reports, because that's not what he's teaching. He's teaching you these. But he's using these to explain those, basically. Yes.
It's going to be very important to revisit this year. Having said that, the book that you did translate by your teaching, I mean, is this lesson in that book, particular book?
I believe it is. Let me see. So with that, okay. Okay, let's do a little promotion here. So I ordered these books. I got a box from the UK. So this is the hadith book that I translated. So it does have, this is not about Bukhari, it's about hadith science. But it does have chapters explaining some of this, I believe. So, I mean, I have it in the footnotes. A lot of this information, I have long footnotes where I explain it. The book is from Sheikh Akram, where he explains various things. So this chart is not in the main body, but I have this entire discussion in one of the footnotes here, and there are a lot of useful footnotes, and there are charts. So I bought these books from the UK, so you wouldn't have to order them from Amazon. Amazon, they're $30. I was able to get them for $20. So I have a box here, anyone wants. A lot of the information will be in here. So there's examples also. But the real book that you might be concerned with or interested in is this one. So I got this last week. Madkhal Ra'i' ila Sahih al-Bukhari. 500-page book in Arabic by Sheikh Akram on Sahih al-Bukhari only. Understanding the chapters, understanding his vision, giving examples of hadith, so many insights. This is the book that you would be interested in if you're really interested in Bukhari. This is a foundation. So this translation I'm working on now, I'm up to chapter 4. I'm really busy these days. Hopefully make dua, Allah gives some barakah in my time. But I hope to get this out in English soon. So this will be a huge, massive, maybe 400, 500 pages in English. And I'll be able to put these charts in there and make it nice and professional. So this just came out last month. It was published recently. So I'm beginning to work on that. That will be a future project. It's kind of massive. This is available now. So I think so. Yeah, I do. And I have Zelle, and I'll let you know, inshallah. So questions on this. This is very complicated. I want you to understand this properly. And I'm going to give you example. I'm going to give you example of tarajum and usul, basically. Okay, let me give you an example first. The easy one is supporting hadith, okay? So there's a hadith here, the one I was trying to locate. It's in Kitab al-Ghusl, the book of Ghusl. And the chapter is called إِذَا جَامَعَ ثُمَّ عَادَ وَمَنْ دَارَ عَلَى نِسَائِهِ فِي غُسْلٍ وَاحِدٍ. So it's a chapter, so this is a book on ghusl, what necessitates the ritual bath, right? When you have relations with your spouses and things like that. So there's a chapter here so the chapter heading, he says, Bab, having sexual intercourse with your spouse and repeating it, okay? And then, وَمَنْ دَارَ عَلَى نِسَائِهِ فِي غُسْلٍ وَاحِدٍ, visiting multiple wives at one time with a single bath. So this hadith, حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال حدثنا ابن أبي عدي ويحيى بن سعيد عن شعبة عن إبراهيم بن محمد بن المنتشر عن أبيه قال ذكرته لعائشة فقال يرحم. No, okay. I want to share the second hadith. حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال حدثنا معاذ بن هشام قال حدثني أبي عن قتادة قال حدثنا أنس بن مالك قال كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يدور على نسائه في الساعة الواحدة من الليل والنهار وهن 11. قال فقلت لأنس أو كان يطيقه قال كنا نتحدث أنه أعطي قوة 30. There's a hadith where Anas bin Malik relates that the Prophet ﷺ used to visit all his wives in one night. Visit all his wives in one night on some occasion. And he said they were 11 in number. So this hadith, it has a strong chain with strong people, and it says the Prophet used to visit his wives in one night, and they were 11 in number. So anyone see a problem here? What's the problem? No, I know. 4 but the Prophet, how many wives did the Prophet have? Yeah, 4 is for us, for normal individuals. But the Prophet, this is one of his. So how many wives did our Prophet? How many mothers do we have from the Prophet? Mothers of the believers. 9, yeah. It's 9, not 11. Prophet never had 11 at one time. No, it was 9. So there were 9 mothers of the believers. So this is a strong hadith. Strong in the sense that the narrators are solid, and they related this hadith. All the individuals are solid. Imam Bukhari reported in the chapter, and Anas bin Malik is reporting that there were 11 in number. Now, that's a problem because historically we know it was 9, it wasn't 11. So if you keep reading the Arabic, Imam al-Bukhari says after that, he reports another isnad. This is in Bukhari. قال سعيد عن قتادة إن أنسا حدثهم 9 نسوة. So he reports a second hadith, a second isnad, and it's not as strong as the first one, so it's a supporting hadith. So as soon as Bukhari relates this hadith, he reports a supporting hadith to correct that mistake, and that supporting hadith says, Sa'id related from Qatada that Anas said they were 9 in number. So what is he doing here? So what he's doing here is, so what's happening here is the first hadith, the hadith is sound, but there's a mistake in it. What that means is even strong and sound reporters could make mistakes. Anyone can make mistakes. So just because all the reporters, sahih, they're sound, they could still make a mistake. And Imam Bukhari knew that. So rather than eliminating that whole hadith, because the hadith is solid, we know that happened, but what's the mistake? It's just a number. The 9 became 11. It's not a huge mistake. So it's still a mistake. but the concept of the hadith is sound. The Prophet did visit his wives more than one in one night. He had the strength for that. And that's something that was peculiar to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to correct the mistake, Imam Bukhari, he knows that 11 is wrong, but the hadith is sahih, the rest of it. So he brought a second isnad right after that might not be the strongest isnad, and it just corrects that mistake. And it just says one word, Inna Anasan haddathahum tis'a niswatin. Anas reported to them through a different isnad that there were 9. So why does Bukhari do that? He just, the chapter has the hadith, but he adds a supporting hadith. It's called mutaba'at, supporting hadith just to correct that mistake. To correct the number, only the number part. So this is brilliant. Like, he didn't leave it, let it be, because he's smart. He knows if there's a mistake, sometimes mistakes might be serious and you leave the whole hadith. But sometimes a mistake could be something like, minor. Like if I told you, like it took me 40 minutes to get here to As-Habul Yameen Sunday morning. If I call my wife, man, it took me 40 minutes to get here. But if I check my GPS, it was 35 minutes. Or it was 44 minutes. Am I lying? That's not a huge thing. These things happen. Like, so just to keep that in mind, in hadith, these things happen. Sometimes the strongest reporters might make minor mistakes like that, and they don't really affect the hadith. But you still have to point them out, and that's what Bukhari is using, supporting hadith to point that out. So now, the supporting hadith, do you consider this a separate hadith? If you do, you're going to give it a separate number. The one I shared with you, the first one was 268. Now he adds another isnad after it as a supporting isnad. You could say this is 269 if you were numbering it. But this edition, they did not number it. That's why they just skipped, because they understood that this is supporting hadith. They didn't give it a number. But if you were publishing, that's why the numbering is off. Like, do you consider this separate hadith or not? It is a separate hadith. But Bukhari's intention was just to correct the mistake in the main hadith. So they didn't assign it a number. But another edition might assign it a number. Let me see what this one does. Yeah, even this one didn't assign a number. So that's an example of what happens here. Imam, yeah. So it is an illah, but it's an illah ghayr qadiha. Illah, yeah. Illah means mistake, defect. But it's a defect that doesn't damage the hadith. Yeah. Yes. Because you have to understand defects are 2 types. Qadiha and ghayr qadiha. That's how scholars looked at them. Not every mistake or defect rejects the hadith. Most of them do. But sometimes the mistake is minor, doesn't affect the grading of the hadith. But for Bukhari, he always relates it with the second hadith just to correct that defect. If you correct that defect, it's no longer a defect. Yeah. Because the detail is minor. If it was an essential, so okay, so if you were to write the book, you see that as a contradiction, you are free not to use it. And other scholars might have that same opinion. But here's to understand that, look at the chapter heading. Chapter heading is about visiting multiple wives in one night. So Imam Bukhari wants to prove, so if you can choose, because of the 9-11 discrepancy, to eliminate this hadith, but then you lose the guidance on can you visit more than one wife in one night. So that part is sahih. The part about 11 is wrong. That's the mistake. So that's what you have to understand. Sometimes there's a mistake in a hadith that's in part of the hadith. But the other part is okay. So the second part is wrong. But it would be a mistake. It would be wrong to eliminate the entire hadith because the mistake is not in the first part. First part is totally sound. It's just in the number. That's a minor mistake. So Imam Bukhari, so you can summarize that Imam Bukhari considered the first part of the hadith to be sahih, and the second part with the 11, he considered to be defective. Therefore, he brought a supporting hadith to correct that. That's what he's doing. So you got to think of hadith as like a little more complex than just one statement, good or bad, rejected or not. The mistake is in part of it, and he eliminated that part. And you can see the supporting part. But the other part is still sound. We can't eliminate that. according to Bukhari.
So basically, as long as we really get the benefit of the message of what it's conveying, what it's saying.
Or you, as long as you relate the part that is sound. So there are a lot of hadith that part of it is sound, part of it is not. It might be something that a mistake made by a transmitter. Here, where did the mistake come from? The transmitter. One of the transmitters, he just changed the number while relating the hadith, changed 9 to 11. The rest of the details are okay. So that's why you have to know where the mistake is, and sometimes, most of the time when you have a major mistake in a hadith, then the hadith is shadh, you reject it. But here, the rest of it is the main part of the hadith not rejected, is not contradicting anything, only that number. So Imam Bukhari fixed that. I mean, had he left it without the supporting isnad, then you could make an argument, wait a minute, the 11 doesn't make sense, it's shadh. But he knew it, and he fixed it. So therefore, when he fixed something, then it's acceptable like that. Yeah, brother. Yeah, you had a question, brother?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it allowed to make? You must make ghusl in between each one.
So according to this hadith, no, because إذا جامع ثم عاد ومن دار على نسائه في غسل واحد. One ghusl for all. So that's what the Prophet did. So to answer that question, right, I'm not going to give you mine, I'll give you Bukhari's answer. Look at the chapter heading. So Imam Bukhari, in the chapter heading, says engaging with one's own wives and taking a single bath after doing so. So Imam Bukhari feels, based on this hadith, that only one ghusl is sufficient. Okay. Yes.
I also heard that he doesn't supposed to leave the house without ghusl.
That, I mean, I'm not getting into the fiqh. I'm teaching you what Bukhari is teaching you. So this is establishing only that point. It's not establishing other points. So those other points, you got to look at other information. Yes. Yeah, exactly what you said. Alhamdulillah. Where's the audience mic? You should just speak into that. Alhamdulillah. I mean, this hadith, this class is, I'm helping you read Bukhari, appreciate his work and his message and what he's trying to teach us. So this is a great example, because this example, you had a question related to it. How do we answer it? By looking at the chapter heading. And also it shows you in this chapter how there could be a supporting hadith. That's not really the main hadith, but it's a supporting hadith added at the end of a hadith. So sometimes Bukhari does, it's not a lot. So don't get confused. This is very minor. It happens very infrequently. Majority of Sahih Bukhari is primary corpus. And then even chapter headings, a lot of them, if you just go through page after page, the chapter heading is just a line or a sentence. Some of them are longer. So how many are long? I think Ibn Hajar counted about 400 were like this long tarajum. There were 400 of them. So it's a massive book, so it's not a huge number, but it's just important to know. I want to share one more example, and this example is more controversial. So this example is about the hadith about music, okay? Is music halal or haram, okay? Musical instruments. Musical instruments, ma'azif. So people always quote a hadith of Bukhari that musical instruments are haram, and that's what they rely on, right? I'm not answering the question today. You have to decide. So I'm telling you in advance, don't ask me it's haram or halal, musical instruments. I'm trying to teach you Imam al-Bukhari and trying to understand what the evidences people use. So let me read you the hadith first. So this is a hadith that everyone quotes, people who believe musical instruments are haram. So the hadith is from among, so I'll skip the isnad, but the hadith is, where is, I'll tell you after. Let me read the hadith first. لا يكونن من أمتي أقوام يستحلون الحر والحرير والخمر والمعازف. So he says, from among the Prophet ﷺ said, from among my followers, there will be people who will consider zina to be halal, permissible, the wearing of silk to be permissible, the drinking of alcoholic drinks, khamr, to be permissible, and the use of musical instruments to be lawful. So that's the hadith. I mean, there's rest of it, but it doesn't have anything to do with that. So this is a hadith people quote a lot. The Prophet said that people will consider this permissible, therefore they're impermissible. So that's the main evidence people use to say that musical instruments are haram. Okay? So now, let's bring our understanding to the issue. Or at least, we're trying to understand what Bukhari said, right? So look at the structure. The first thing you want to do is, okay, this hadith, where is it? Is it usul or secondary? And where is it, and what chapter heading it's under, to try to understand what Bukhari was thinking about that hadith. So people stand up and say, this is a hadith, it's in Bukhari, and they're haram. But that's not the case, because first the Kitab al-Ashriba, the book of drinks. So this hadith is under the book of drinks. So drinks. Okay? That's a clue. Just think about it. So Imam Bukhari placed this in the book of drinks. And then the bab. What is the bab? ما جاء في من يستحل الخمر ويسميه بغير اسمه. The chapter on what is said regarding the people deeming alcohol to be lawful and calling it by another name. So the book about drinks, the chapter is about making alcohol permissible. And in that he quotes this hadith. Okay? So what can we conclude? We can conclude that Imam Bukhari is using this hadith to show you that alcohol is haram, and there will be people that might consider permissible, but they would be wrong, because alcohol by any name, you could call it any name you want, but it's always going to be haram, because that's in the Quran. إِنَّمَا الْخَمْرُ وَالْمَيْسِرُ. There's a verse about that. So alcohol is haram. That's what he's trying to teach you. So where do we get the music and the other part? So to understand that deeper, the first issue is this hadith has a number, 5590. But in the beginning, Imam Bukhari says it should be haddathana, right? Or akhbarana. He says, qala Hisham ibn Ammar. Then haddathana Sadaqa bin Khalid. So this is a mu'allaq hadith. It's nadless. He's just quoting someone. He's not relating with haddathani. So this hadith is a mu'allaqat hadith. So it's not main body. So it's a mu'allaqat hadith. So first of all, so number one, it's a mu'allaqat hadith. So to say that it's hadith in Sahih Bukhari is inaccurate, because Imam Bukhari never put it in his primary corpus, because he knows it's not Sahih. It's not primary tier Sahih. You could discuss, okay, what is it? Is it fabricated, defective, or still acceptable? That's a different issue. But first, you have to establish Imam Bukhari did not quote this hadith to show you that it's Sahih. He never considered it primary tier Sahih. It's not in his primary corpus. But he uses it as a mu'allaq hadith in a chapter heading, and the translators, by mistake, put it as a hadith under the chapter, but it's supposed to be part of the chapter heading. And the clue there is waqala Hisham. Okay? There's no isnad for it. I mean, there's a partial isnad. Imam Bukhari doesn't link himself to the isnad. So that's one clue. So whatever this hadith is, it's not sahih according to Bukhari. Right? According to Bukhari's conditions. So you can't quote, oh, it's in Bukhari. And secondly, when Bukhari quoted it, he put it under Kitab al-Ashriba. So what that means is he felt that the part about the khamr was sound or acceptable enough to be used in a supporting capacity, second tier sahih, but not the part about the music and the other parts. Why? Because, okay, how do we prove that? Imam Bukhari's style in hadith is, he takes one hadith, he'll relate it 10 times, 12 times throughout the sahih to give you multiple benefits. This hadith is the meaning is so strong. If it was sound, he would have used it in multiple chapters. He only used it here once. There are chapters that have talk about wasting time. There are chapters that are more relevant to music. He never shares that hadith. So when you look at this whole methodology, you can understand Bukhari never considered that musical instrument part to be sound. But he just shared it because it's part of the hadith. But he shared it, we look at the chapter heading, he wanted to use the alcohol part, not the rest of the part. So this is not a sound hadith. Ibn Hazm said on musical instrument, there is not a single sound hadith. Every single one is fabricated. So this hadith, if you analyze it, is extremely weak, the musical instrument part. So I'm not giving you a judgment, but I'm telling you the proof people use is not accurate. And because of these mistakes, not understanding Bukhari, this hadith is the main evidence for people who consider musical instruments to be haram. I mean, there are other evidence that's indirect, like wasting time. So Ibn Hazm didn't consider musical instruments to be haram, but he never did it himself. He considered them to be a waste of time because he was a scholar. But to call them haram is something different. And the only strong explicit evidence, or one of the few explicit evidences we have is this. There's a verse of the Quran about lahu, wasting time. That's indirect. That's not strong enough, and it's not, Allah doesn't say musical instrument. There's a tafsir of that. Some of the scholars applied it to that. But the strongest hadith we have is this, and it's a non-hadith. It's not really a strong hadith. So that's why you have to understand the structure of Imam Bukhari. If Imam Bukhari considered them to be haram, or that portion to be acceptable, he would have used it throughout his sahih. They would have fit in many parts. He never used it. He only put it in chapter heading only to prove the alcohol part. And when he studied the hadith, analysis of this hadith, the alcohol part is sound, but the other isn't. And that's the point Brother Yahya was trying to share with you, that hadith, often it's the case, part of the hadith is good, and part of it is a mistake. So it's not the whole hadith, but part of it might be acceptable. Imam Muslim or someone else like that would probably take this hadith, you know what, it's not acceptable, it's not sound, they'll eliminate it. But Bukhari, being the genius, he's trying to see if he could use that hadith in some way, or a portion of that hadith. So he feels a portion of that hadith is acceptable, he doesn't want to waste it. He wants to use it for something. But he won't put it in his main body, but he'll put it in his summarize. That shows you his genius. He was bold, he was courageous, and he was doing these things. And when we don't understand his methodology, what he was trying to do, we run into trouble. We just think all the hadith at the same level, it's in Bukhari, and so on and so forth. It is not in Bukhari. You can say it's a footnote. It's a part of the tarajum, part of the mu'allaqat. Okay? You can have whatever position you want on the issue, but you got to be clear about the evidences, and you have to be accurate. You can't fudge the evidences, and you can't claim things, that it's in Bukhari, it is not in the primary corpus. Wallahu a'lam. Okay. Any questions? Those are two examples I wanted to share to try to bring the structure to you, to make the structure come alive. But very, very important. I know it's a lot of stuff, but it's very, very important to understand the structure of Sahih al-Bukhari in order to understand the implications and the meanings of the hadith. Okay. Yes, brother.
I was reading this book here today, and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba.
So.
So Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam told Bilal to wake him up to Fajr, and both of them overslept Fajr. Now I kept reading, so they said that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam woke up and told Bilal to call the advance. In another way, it says Prophet Muhammad woke up and told him to call the Imam. So I kept going back and forth and reading. So which one is it?
So in Arabic, the word adhan is used for both. So uh, I would have to look at the hadith, but adhan and iqama is an English translation, but in Arabic it's nida or adhan. So in Arabic sometimes the same word is used. So which one was it? You would have to like read the report and put them all together and try to come to an understanding. But in Arabic it doesn't matter. You're calling to prayer. They're both calls to prayer. We call them nida, call them adhan. And when the Prophet woke up late, Allahu A'lam, after look at the issue, did he make adhan and iqama or just the iqama? Allahu A'lam. Good question. I would have to look into that. Okay. Yes, brother.
Now, you have the different editions of the Sahih Bukhari.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a compilation. It's one book. So is there any real distinction between these different prints?
Well, so this one is Darul Fikr. That's notorious Darul Fikr for making mistakes. So this Darul Fikr is not a reliable uh, uh, book publisher. I don't know if they changed. Um, that's not the famous Darul Fikr, but when I was in Rutgers, I remember this company had just come out, and they were releasing all these hadith books very cheap, but they're filled with mistakes. So it's not reliable at all. So I would avoid this one. Darus Salam generally is uh, probably the largest bookseller worldwide. Their print is nice and their editions are good, but they also have mistakes. Like here is a mistake, and there's a major mistake in Darus Salam, Hadith number 7 that I share in my Bukhari class. Mustafa probably remembers. So every edition is not free of mistakes. Well, or no edition is free of mistakes. But out of the editions, I guess Darus Salam is the only one we have. We don't have a whole lot. That's the most reliable one so far. But the translations are the same. This is the same translation, Muhsin Khan. So there's a need for a better translation. I know, I think Jonathan Brown was working on a translation of Sahih Al-Bukhari. I don't know how far along his project is. But it's a need for doing a proper translation. Muhsin Khan did great work. And, the entire ummah is indebted to him. But he wasn't from America. He wasn't an English speaker. That wasn't his native tongue. So the translation does have some defects, and so there's always a need to, better whatever work is out there to improve on it, and so there's a need for a better Sahih Bukhari edition. So there's a lot of research being done on Sahih Bukhari. Even scholars don't understand all of this, and that's a lot of this. People used to know it, but then kind of fell out, and a lot of people don't have awareness of these. Even many scholars, they quote hadith incorrectly. They quote it in Bukhari, they might not understand that it's here. Even someone as great as Shaykh Nasiruddin al-Albani, rahimahullah, there are hadith that he deemed weak to be in Sahih Muslim. They're weak, and he says Imam Muslim made a mistake, but they weren't even prior to the primary corpus. He didn't understand that they were part of supporting capacity. Even Imam Muslim didn't consider them to be sound. So not understanding this, even the best scholars can fall into those mistakes. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out, the hadith is sorry, Hassan or whatever it is, and then he's done behind it. What do you do? Do you trace the whole isnad or?
Yeah, so he spent his life researching isnad and making his own determinations of all the hadith. So he did that, spent his whole life doing that, and he's one of the few people that did that. Like, not a whole lot of people looked at all hadith. So he did great work, but it comes down to, at the end of the day, do you trust him or not? So, I mean, yeah, so he's a contemporary scholar. So for many of us, what we do is, I rather trust Bukhari and Muslim, and I always use his gradings as something you look at and consider, but it's not the final word. So no human being is the final word except mutaqaddimin, the early scholars, those only ones that deserve to be the final word. So another way of looking at it is, if it's in primary corpus, Bukhari and Muslim, that's Sahih. And if it's in Tirmidhi and Abu Dawud and they consider it Sahih, or Imam Ahmad, then we call it secondary tier Sahih. But then contemporary scholars, not just Albani, it was a few other scholars, Shoaib, Arnaout, and others, they did a lot of grading work. And their scholarship was good, but it was contemporary and it was kind of superficial. They weren't living in this era. They didn't have access to the same resources from this era. And some of them, they made silly mistakes, not understanding structures like this. So it's not the final word. I don't eliminate it entirely. So I always look at his gradings as a piece of, but if you have a hadith that's not in Bukhari or Muslim, and someone later, whether it's Albani or Arnaout, considers Sahih, take that with a grain of salt. That's my principle for you. Because Bukhari and Muslim certainly were aware of that hadith, they didn't accept it for a reason. And someone who comes later saying it's Sahih, it might still be acceptable. It might be second tier Sahih. But I would never consider it to be primary tier Sahih. It's just not possible. Wallahu a'lam. And that goes for any human being, not just Shaykh Albani, any human being that does grading of hadith. You know, they use their best resources, but this work was already done in the early times. So it's not like the work was never done and now we have to do all that work. There's still a need to like weigh evidences and give us a proper understanding. So he did remarkable work. But there are a lot of mistakes that Shaykh Albani made because he had access to a lot of books, but he didn't read the books with teachers because of that. So I know he's a controversial figure. A lot of the criticism of his is unwarranted because people just hate him. So when people hate on somebody, then the criticism just doesn't make sense because it's just coming out of blind fanatical hatred. So most of the criticism is unwarranted, but there are great scholars that respect him and they still criticize him. So that's the criticism you want to look at. Like Sheikh Hassan Didu of Mauritania, he has a nice article about Sheikh Albani, respectful article about his great contribution, but also his failings and his defects in scholarship. So, we respect him. You can take it with a grain of salt. And not only him, but any other scholar. But I'm here trying to make you appreciate Bukhari. Bukhari and Muslim, when they agree upon a hadith, that's solid. And then Bukhari, when he puts a hadith primary corpus, not in these chapter headings, but primary corpus, it's solid. And then a Muslim, when he puts it in the primary corpus, is solid. So this is a useful guide. The strongest hadith, Bukhari plus Muslim in both. Number 2, Bukhari alone. The third level, Muslim alone. And then fourth onwards are fourth you can say Tirmidhi, Ahmad, Abu Dawud, when they consider a hadith sahih. Not every hadith in their book, but if Abu Dawud said, هذا hadithun sahihun, or Imam Ahmad said, this hadith is sahih, or Imam Tirmidhi said, this hadith is sahih. Not all the hadith in their books they say that about. But if they say that, that's also pretty good. That's fourth level, fourth grade. And then after that, everyone else falls here. Hakim, Albani, contemporary scholars. So this is fifth grade, like a fifth tier. So it can never be up to this level. So this is the level you should be looking at. That's my personal guide, yes. No, it's together. I mean, that just came to my mind. But this is all one level. Come on, brother. All right, I'll put it here. There you go. Now you're going to ask me why I put it at the end? But the numbers, I'm telling you, this is the level. Great scholars, other than Bukhari and Muslim, the early scholars, if they deem the hadith sahih, it's still pretty acceptable, but it's not going to be of this level. So this is the first level, second level, and then third level is just grain of salt. That's it. Oh, Adhan, go ahead.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا